With a roaring sound that shattered the stillness of the morning, something fell from the sky. There was a brief flash, an explosion in the sky, and the object plunged through the atmosphere, trailing smoke and fire, before crashing violently into the Little League field of Mount Comfort's elementary school. In the quiet hospital several blocks away, Dr. Lena Harper jolted from her chair. She was a tall woman in her 40s, her brown hair streaked with silver and tied neatly into a bun. "What on earth?" she murmured, her heart racing. Without hesitation, she moved swiftly down the corridor, her long strides taking her toward the exit. As she pushed through the hospital's main doors, Lena smelled something burning. Ash drifted down like sinister snowflakes. The streets of the small, peaceful town of Mount Comfort, New Mexico, were suddenly alive with alarm. Neighbors were rushing out of their homes, while children stopped in their tracks on their way to school, all of them staring at the plume of smoke rising in the distance. Lena reached the Little League field as the first fire trucks were pulling in, their sirens wailing loudly and urgently. In the middle of the field, smoldering and partially embedded into the earth, was wreckage unlike anything she had ever seen. It was metallic and oddly shaped, not like any plane she knew of. Nearby trees were scorched, their leaves ablaze. People were gathering, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. Lena spotted Jim, the school's janitor, his face as white as chalk. "Jim!" Lena called, rushing over. "Are you okay? Was anyone hurt?" He shook his head, still staring at the wreckage. No, the Little League team was practicing, but thank God nobody was hurt. "But Lena..." His voice dropped to a whisper. "That's no plane." Following his gaze, Lena could see it too. Amidst the twisted metal and smoky ruin, she saw a figure. A body, but not human. Its skin was a shade of grayish blue Lena had never seen on a living being. Its limbs were elongated, its eyes large and dark. The local police, led by Sheriff Martinez, arrived swiftly, setting up a perimeter and urging the gathering crowd to step back. "No one gets closer," Sheriff Martinez commanded, his voice echoing with authority. Lena, a doctor and a fixture in Mount Comfort, felt a protective surge. "I'm a doctor," she said, stepping forward. "Is anyone hurt?" Sheriff Martinez met Lena's eyes. They were kind but firm. "I'm sorry, Lena," he said, "but we can't let anyone near this. We don't know what we're dealing with yet." As Lena was ushered away along with the growing crowd, she cast one last look at the otherworldly figure amidst the wreckage. The serene, predictable life of Mount Comfort seemed to have shattered in that moment, and Lena felt it in her bones. Her life and the lives of her neighbors were about to change dramatically. The sun rose higher, but the shadows cast on the town of Mount Comfort grew darker. The news spread quickly. Everyone in town had either seen the fall from the sky or heard about it by now. By midday, the elementary school's Little League field looked like a scene from a science fiction movie. The police had quickly cordoned off the crash site. Government vehicles, unmarked but clearly official, were parked in neat rows. Men and women in uniforms moved purposefully, their faces set and impassive. In the hospital, Lena cleaned ash and sweat from her face with a damp cloth. She had been tending to the children who'd been present at the crash. Minor burns, cuts, and lots of fear, but no serious physical harm. Emotional wounds would take longer to assess. A nurse from her department, Grace, entered with a solemn expression. "They're telling people to stay indoors," she said softly. "There are soldiers blocking the roads out of town, and they've cut our phone lines. Internet's down too." Lena's eyes narrowed. The situation was escalating far faster than she could have ever imagined. "I need to speak to Sheriff Martinez," Lena decided aloud, her voice steady. Grace nodded and went to find him, knowing Lena had earned the right to be in the loop. Before long, Sheriff Martinez arrived at the hospital, his uniform dusty and his face weary. "It's a quarantine," he explained to Lena, avoiding her gaze. "The government's orders. They're afraid of contamination, from the crash or the being." Lena crossed her arms, her medical coat wrapping tight. "Contamination? There are scared children, Martinez. Scared parents. This is our town. We deserve to know what's happening." Martinez sighed deeply. He respected Lena. They had worked together on countless emergencies over the years. "I agree," he finally said, "but my hands are tied. For now, we follow orders and keep the peace. That's all we can do." He paused, then added, "But I will let you know anything I find out as soon as I can. You have my word." Their conversation was interrupted when a commotion arose outside the waiting area. Lena and Martinez rushed out to find a group of parents arguing loudly with soldiers who had secured the entrance to the hospital. "We just want to see our kids," a mother cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "I understand, ma'am," a soldier replied, his tone rigid but not unkind. "We are doing this for the safety of everyone here." Lena stepped in, her presence immediately drawing attention. "These are their children," she said, her voice clear and commanding. "You will let them through." In that charged moment, the soldier seemed to weigh his options, then nodded curtly. "Let them through," he ordered, stepping aside. As the parents rushed past to find their children, Lena turned to Martinez. Her eyes, usually warm, were hard as flint. "This isn't right," she whispered fiercely. "I know," Martinez replied, his voice low. "And we're going to figure this out." In the uneasy silence that followed, they both felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. The calm and routine of Mount Comfort had fractured, replaced by fear and a chilling sense that something really big was happening. The 10-foot barbed wire fence was a menacing sight, snaking its way around the entirety of Mount Comfort. The once welcoming small town was now encircled by this cold, metallic barrier, a stark contrast to the soft, picturesque landscape it marred. Beyond the fence, armed soldiers stood at regular intervals, their faces impassive but their eyes always watching, always assessing. They were the unwelcome wardens of this newfound prison, and they allowed no one to pass the boundary they guarded. The soldier had been given orders to shoot anyone who attempted to get past the fence. Inside the town, everything was unusually quiet. The army had cut off all forms of communication with the rest of the world. There was no internet, televisions showed only static, radios were silent, and phones couldn't get a signal. Mount Comfort was now completely cut off and isolated from the outside world. In the quiet hospital several blocks away from the imposing fence, Dr. Lena Harper moved from room to room, her steps echoing a bit louder than before. The disconnect from the outside world was more than a physical barrier. It weighed heavily on her and her staff. Now they were completely dependent on the army for medical supplies, and with the hospital nearly at capacity, they were quickly running low on nearly all of their essential medications and supplies. Not only that, the army had cordoned off an entire wing of the hospital, transforming it into a restricted zone guarded day and night by stern-faced soldiers. Heavy steel doors were installed, marking the boundary between the familiar hospital corridors and this off-limits area. Word had spread through the hospital staff that behind that door lay the body discovered at the crash site, an entity not of this world. Nurses whispered in hushed tones about the odd, almost ethereal presence they felt when walking past the guarded wing. Her heart ached for her town, for the normalcy they had lost so abruptly. As she turned back to her rounds, Grace approached hurriedly. "Dr. Harper," she called, her voice tight. "We have a situation." Lena followed Grace to a patient room where chaos had erupted. Inside, 8-year-old Timmy Lewis, one of the kids who had been on the Little League field during the crash, was burning up with fever, his small body writhing in his bed. His mother, Clara, was at his side, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "He was fine last night," Clara sobbed, "and then this morning he woke up like this." Lena quickly moved to Timmy's side, her hands deft as she checked his vitals. His skin was hot to the touch, his pulse racing. "It's all right, Clara," Lena said softly but firmly. "We're going to help him." As she worked, Lena's mind raced. This wasn't a normal fever. She'd seen plenty of sick children in her time, but Timmy's condition had escalated too quickly. It was severe and sudden. She ordered a battery of tests and sent Grace to prepare an isolation room. They didn't know what they were dealing with, and she wasn't going to take any chances with the other patients. As she administered a cooling compress to Timmy's forehead, Sheriff Martinez entered the room, his hat held in his hands respectfully. "Can I talk with you for a minute, Doctor?" he asked. Lena and Martinez step out into the hallway together. "I heard about Timmy," he said, his voice soft. "Is this related to the situation?" Lena glanced at him, her eyes reflecting her exhaustion and worry. "I don't know. she admitted. "But this is no ordinary fever." Martinez looked at the child in the room, his face lined with concern. "More reason to get some answers," he said. "I've been talking to a contact in the army. There's more to this quarantine than we're being told." In that moment, Lena made a decision, her resolve hardening. "Then we need to find out what in the world is going on," she said. "We owe it to our patients, to our town." Martinez nodded, his respect for Lena deepening. "I'm with you, Lena. We'll figure this out together." The morning after the fence went up, Dr. Lena Harper arrived at the hospital to find the emergency room a hive of activity. Parents clutched their children, elderly folks leaned on their kin, and everyone wore a face of worry. Word had spread about Timmy's sudden fever, and now more townspeople were falling ill in the same way. Nurses moved briskly from room to room, and the front desk was swamped by a storm of angry and desperate questions. "Dr. Harper," Grace called out as Lena walked in. She looked stressed, her normally neat uniform slightly disheveled. "We've got 7 more cases like Timmy since last night." Lena felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Same symptoms?" she asked. "Exactly the same," Grace replied, her voice quivering. "High fever, severe headaches. It's spreading fast." Lena took a deep breath, steadying herself. "All right," she said firmly. "Let's set up a quarantine wing. We'll move all the patients with these symptoms there, and notify their families, but no visitors for now. We can't risk it spreading further." As Lena moved through the hospital, she saw the fear in the eyes of her staff and patients alike. But she also saw resolve. These were her friends and neighbors, and she knew they were counting on her. Hours passed like minutes, and soon the quarantine wing was full. Lena moved between the beds, speaking softly to each patient, offering words of comfort and assurance as she examined them. At the bedside of Mrs. Wilson, an elderly woman she had known for years, Lena's professional demeanor almost broke. Mrs. Wilson's feverish face was flushed, but she managed a weak smile for Lena. "You're doing your best, dear," she whispered, her voice hoarse but tender. Lena squeezed her hand gently. "We're going to get you better, Mrs. Wilson," she promised. Amidst this growing crisis, Lena found a moment to step into her office and close the door. She needed just a minute to breathe, to think. On her desk were stacks of medical journals and her laptop, now rendered almost useless without the internet. She wished she could consult with experts outside Mount Comfort, seek guidance from infectious disease specialists, but the town's isolation made that impossible. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Lena looked up to see Sheriff Martinez. His presence was a comfort, his steady demeanor a grounding force amidst the chaos. "I spoke to the commanding officer at the fence," Martinez said, his tone grave. "They aren't giving us anything, just that they are handling the situation and following protocol. It's like talking to a wall." Lena sighed, frustration welling up inside her. "We are being kept in the dark, while our people are suffering," she said, her voice carrying a rare edge of anger. "We can't even reach out for help." Martinez stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on Lena's shoulder. "We're not giving up," he said firmly. "We're going to figure this out. For Mrs. Wilson, for Timmy, for everyone." Inside the quarantine wing, the atmosphere was thick with tension and despair. Nurses hurried through the stark, sterile corridors, their faces strained and weary. Overhead, fluorescent lights cast an unforgiving glare on the scene unfolding. At the center of this whirlpool of activity was Dr. Lena Harper. Her white coat, once immaculate, was now marred with sweat and stains, a stark reflection of the relentless hours she had spent at the bedsides of her patients. The air was charged with urgency as violent seizures gripped patient after patient. One moment, they were lying in bed, weak but conscious. The next, their bodies convulsed violently, eyes rolling back, as if they were being pulled into some unseen abyss. "Hold him steady," Lena commanded as she rushed to an elderly man's side. His body was arched off the bed, muscles tensed in agonizing spasms. Nurses held his limbs, trying to prevent him from injuring himself. Lena administered a sedative with practiced hands, her face set in grim determination. Slowly, the patient's convulsions eased, but his eyes remained vacant, unresponsive. Grace turned to Lena, her voice quivering. "It's happening to all of them, Dr. Harper. One by one, they're falling into this catatonic state. What can we do?" Lena's eyes moved swiftly across the room. It was a tableau of anguish. Families clutching the hands of their loved ones, sobbing and pleading for a miracle that Lena felt increasingly powerless to deliver. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We keep them comfortable," Lena replied, her voice steady but softer now. "And we don't give up." In a quiet corner of the wing, Lena noticed Timmy, the young boy who loved baseball. Timmy's face, once flushed with fever, was now eerily calm and ashen, his young eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. As Lena stood in the quarantine wing of the hospital, the walls seemed to close in around her. The clinical beeps of heart monitors, once a reassuring background rhythm, now sounded like a dirge. Desperation clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. She stepped into her small office, a brief refuge from the chaos outside. As she sank into her chair, Lena allowed herself a moment, just a moment, to feel the weight of it all. Her eyes welled with tears that she blinked back fiercely. "This isn't over," she whispered to herself, a mantra of resilience. "I won't let it be over." As she rose, her resolve solidified. She was not just a witness to this nightmare, she was a fighter in the midst of it. With that steel in her spine, she returned to the fray, to her patience and her duty. Later that night, Dr. Harper moved swiftly through the dim hallways of the hospital. The building was quiet, save for the distant hum of machinery and the muffled cries of the ill. Beside her, Sheriff Martinez walked with a determined stride. His dark eyes were serious, and the set of his jaw told Lena that he was as resolute as she was. The sheriff had risked his career to help her, she knew, and she was grateful. "Are you sure about this?" Martinez asked in a low voice, glancing toward Lena. His question wasn't a challenge, it was a sign of genuine concern. "We need answers, Sheriff," Lena replied, her voice steady, "and they're in that room." The pair arrived at the restricted area at the end of a long hallway. Official-looking signs hastily put up by the Army declared the area off-limits. The door was heavily guarded during the day, but Lena knew that at this hour, there would only be one soldier guarding the door. About half an hour earlier, Lena had been chatting with the guard. With a smile on her face and 2 cups of coffee in her hands, she thanked the soldier for his service and offered him one of the steaming cups of coffee. "It's not the freshest, but it's pretty good," she said with a wry smile. The soldier nodded as he took the cup. "Thanks, Doctor. It's got to be better than what we get at the chow hall." The coffee that Lena had given the soldier was spiked with a strong laxative, and now all they had to do was wait for the guard to go to the bathroom. After about 30 minutes, the guard got a strange look on his face and quickly ran to the bathroom. Lena and Martinez looked at each other and nodded. Sheriff Martinez produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the door. It swung open noiselessly, revealing a room that was chilling in its sterility. Inside, the alien body lay on an operating table, as still and pale as a marble statue. Its grayish-blue skin seemed to glow faintly under the harsh lights. Lena's heart caught in her throat at the sight. Here was a being from another world, its body holding secrets that could perhaps save her town or seal its fate. Without hesitation, Lena approached the table. She donned gloves with practiced efficiency and selected a scalpel from a tray of instruments. As she made a careful incision to collect a tissue sample, her hands were steady, but she couldn't ignore the surreal nature of the moment. Martinez kept watch at the door, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "I can't believe we're doing this," he whispered, almost to himself. Lena carefully placed the tissue sample into a sterile container. "Desperate times," she replied softly. "Call for desperate measures." As she worked, Lena couldn't help but study the creature. It was undeniably different, yet its form was hauntingly familiar. 2 eyes, a mouth, limbs. It was a somber reminder that they were dealing with a life form, one that met a violent end far from home. "I wonder what it was like," Lena mused quietly. Where it came from, what it wanted. She looked up at Martinez, finding an unexpected kindred curiosity in his eyes. "It doesn't look like a monster," Martinez observed. "No," Lena agreed, "it doesn't." Their brief connection was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway, sharp and rhythmic. Martinez's eyes widened. "We need to go, now," he urged, urgency sharpening his whisper. With the precious sample secured, Lena quickly followed Martinez out of the room. As he closed the door behind them, they quickly walked down the hallway, turning the corner just seconds before the soldier returned to his post guarding the door. Lena clutched the sample container close to her chest. She had no idea what the tissue samples would show, or if she would even be able to learn anything from them. But for the first time in days, hope flickered in her eyes. The following day, ominous storm clouds had begun to gather on the horizon. As mid-afternoon approached, the sky had transformed into a deep, brooding gray, and the wind had intensified, whipping through the streets with growing ferocity. Inside the hospital's lab, Dr. Lena Harper was hunched over a microscope, her brow furrowed in concentration. In her hands, carefully prepared on a glass slide, were the tissue samples she had taken from the alien body. To her trained eye, they weren't behaving like any normal cells should. They seemed to be alive, mutating in a way that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. "It's almost as if they're adapting," she whispered to herself, noting the strange pulsating movement within the cells, evolving right before our eyes. Before she could delve further into this mysterious behavior, the world around her went black. The power in the hospital had gone out, leaving Lena in a sudden and complete darkness that was as disorienting as it was unexpected. For those few stretched out seconds, the only sounds were the howling of the wind outside and the distant rumble of thunder, an eerie serenade to the chaos unfolding within the hospital walls. Then with a jolt, the backup generators roared to life. Fluorescent lights flickered back on, casting the hallways and rooms in a stark, cold light. But the scene that awaited the hospital staff as the lights returned was one of sheer horror. Every single patient in the quarantine wing, who had been bedridden and unresponsive just moments ago, was now standing upright. Their arms were outstretched toward the ceiling, as if reaching for something far beyond the confines of the hospital, far beyond the stormy sky outside. Their faces were blank, but in their eyes was an eerie serenity that sent chills down Lena's spine. And then the chant began, a phrase repeated in perfect, haunting unison. "They are coming. They are coming."